So this is the Pixel 6 Pro, the latest and greatest from Google, and honestly, at least on paper, this has been the phone I've wanted from Google for a very long time. So, is it worth your hard-earned dosh or not? Let's find out. First off, as always, we have the specs. And this is actually really cool as this is the first Pixel phone with a Google design processor rather than a Snapdragon one. It features the all-new Google Tensor processor, a Mali G7a MP20 GPU, 12GB of RAM, which is a lot compared to what I'm used to on the iPhone side of things. Multiple storage options being 128, 256, and 512GB, which is a good range for those who don't need a load of storage, to those who want a lot of local files, so always nice you got options. It weighs in at 210 grams, which is again, a lot compared to what I'm used to, but considering the build and size of this phone, this isn't all that surprising. Finally, there are several color options, including black, slightly sunny, and this one here, white. As for specs, other than the battery life and the screen as they get their own dedicated sections later on, that's pretty much it. Now, we are going to be talking about how this thing performs later on, but for now, how's the build quality? Well, the Pixel 6 Pro is a pretty polarizing design. Some love it, some hate it, and while it is true it took me a good while to adjust to the camera bar and, well, the size, I really like it. In person, this thing looks absolutely incredible, despite how much the camera bar sticks out. But again, this is kind of subjective. It's also built well. The front and back are Gorilla Glass Victus with an aluminium frame, and in terms of how this thing feels in your hand, it's pretty awesome. It also features an IP68 water resistance rating, which is always good to see, meaning that your Pixel will be protected if you get it wet. Overall, while this thing looks and feels very nice in my opinion, and also features some nice strong materials, I would, as always, still recommend a case. Now, I did accidentally drop it a couple of times even when filming, but I just wouldn't risk it. Dropping a phone that is like almost entirely glass, if it does break, repair costs, not going to be very nice. Following on, we have the screen. The Pixel 6 Pro has an LTPO AMOLED 120Hz, HDR10 enabled 6.81-inch 1440 by 3120 screen. Oh man, that was a lot of numbers. One cool thing about the 120Hz refresh rate is that it does actually have that variable refresh rate technology. And this is nice. You don't always need to be looking at everything in 120Hz. So the fact that it turns down is nice for some battery savings. If you want, you can look up the rest of the really techie specs, but in simple terms, it's big and it looks insane. Watching videos on this thing is truly an experience to behold due to, in part, the sheer size and also the quality of this screen. It really is kind of awesome. Colors and contrast both look awesome. It's bright enough for any situation I tried, and while a phone of this size isn't exactly all that practical for someone like me, a lot of people like big phones, and as a big phone goes, this screen is awesome. Now again, something I will say due to the sheer size, resolution, brightness, and refresh rate, it's definitely going to be a drain on the battery life, so you may not want to be running it at full blast all the time, but man, when you are, it's awesome. Following on, we have the button layout. The 6 Pro does feature a volume bar versus separate volume up and down buttons, which historically I'm not really that big of a fan of. In fact, that was one of my biggest criticisms of the button layout on the Pixel 4a, and it also has a lock button above it. But seeing as there is a volume bar, it's pretty easy to know which is which. There's also a nice little divot in the chassis, which is a nice design choice, as again, it helps you to avoid those misclicks, and it's also compatible with the Android 12 double tap back configuration. Other than that though, that's it. Not exactly a lot of buttons on this phone. That said though, despite the fact that I'm not a huge fan of volume bars, all the buttons do feel nice and tactile, and after a while, you certainly do get used to the button layout of this phone. After this, we have the fingerprint sensor, which is an underscreen one. I'm not usually a super big fan of these. They've never been super consistent in my experience, and I was extra skeptical seeing as I'd actually heard a lot of people talking about how they weren't really a big fan. But in my testing, it's actually pretty good. It's nice and fast. I almost always got it on the first try. I'm honestly gonna say that I'd prefer to have this. I would rather see features developed on rather than companies just sticking to the safe options. So hopefully this is what Google do. What I'm hoping they'll do is they'll build on this technology so over time the fingerprint sensor does get better. And hey, maybe we will get a fingerprint sensor that can say it's on par with the hardware variant. Something I will quickly say is that you do want to make sure that when you're scanning your finger, you want to get it on the spot with with underscreen fingerprint scanners that I've used in the past, I have noticed that it is kind of easy to put your finger outside of the scan zone, purely because it's all a uniform area, which isn't the case on hardware ones. So yeah, make sure you do that, and it should be pretty good. All right, so next up, we're going to be talking about the camera, and I will do my very best to keep this under 4 hours long, for your sake and mine. In terms of specs, the main camera has been upgraded to a 50 megapixel f1.9 camera. Yes, 50 megapixels. That is insane. The telephoto lens also got a nice upgrade with a 48 megapixel f3.4 camera. That's also 4 times optical zoom, by the way, which is nice. But the ultra-wide camera is still sitting at a pretty standard 12 megapixels with an aperture of f2.2. Okay, so those are some crazy big numbers, but how does it perform? Well, honestly, it's one of the best camera systems I've ever used. Thanks to the high resolution, digital zoom is now finally a possibility, along with the freedom to crop in a decent amount in post, which has never really been a strong suit on phones, so it's nice that you can do this here. Now, I became a fan of Google's photo system ever since I first tried the Pixel line, and here, it's definitely done it justice. All the lenses look great, although the standard and telephoto lens are noticeably better than the ultra-wide. Again, thanks to the higher resolution. Realistically, you don't want to crop in too much on the ultra-wide. Then again, chances are you're not really going to be. But all of them still do look great. All have nice colors, great sharpness, great dynamic range, and some nice levels of saturation. In terms of portrait mode, it works a treat as always. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I personally do prefer the portrait mode on the Pixel side of things to the iPhone side of things. The autofocus tracking, especially in this mode, works a treat, and while it only works on the main lens instead of the telephoto lens as well, which is a huge missed opportunity in my opinion, as well as the background blur not looking as natural as you'd expect from a system trying to replicate a full-frame DSLR, you can still get some pretty awesome pictures. Night sight, as always, also works a treat. You can get some great, clean low-light shots, and while I do still prefer iPhones in this regard, as it feels like you're getting a little bit more control as you're taking the photo, the results you can get from the Pixel are definitely impressive. Autofocus is, as I said, very impressive, and overall, taking photos with the Pixel 6 Pro, definitely a very good experience. But how's the video? Well, on the Pixel 6 Pro, you get 4K at up to 60 FPS, which is nice, seeing as, again, the Pixel 4a that I previously tested only went up to 30 FPS. So honestly, it's nice to have one of my favorite formats back. This looks great, as you'd expect. Dynamic range is good, color science is nice, and the stabilization is awesome. It also shoots slow motion 1080p at up to 240 FPS, and while this certainly isn't going to look as good as the 4K 60, filming in this ultra slow motion was a pretty nice experience. Quickly going over the front-facing camera, it's an 11.1 megapixel f2.2mm camera. Again, nice color science, nice dynamic range, and it takes good selfies. In terms of video in this mode, you get 4K at up to 30 FPS, and while 60 FPS would certainly have been a nice to have, I personally don't think it's as useful to have 4K on the front-facing camera as it is the main camera, and for some casual vlogging action, the 6 Pro certainly does a good job, again, with some very nice dynamic range and color science. Okay, so all in all, the camera has definitely been a standout point of the Pixel since the line launched, but here Google definitely seemed to have pushed the boat out, especially in terms of photo. I personally had an absolute blast taking photos with the 6 Pro, and if you are a keen mobile photographer, it certainly won't let you down. Okay, so moving on to objectively the most important aspect of any modern smartphone, we have OS and app performance. I brand the Google 6 Pro with Android 12, and while this is a little bit of a divisive operating system, it's certainly a nice experience. What's more, another specific 6 Pro thing that I love is the 5 years of support as a minimum. This is something I've been wanting to see on Android for ages. In my opinion, this was an area where Android was lagging behind iPhone, so to have an Android that's truly competitive in terms of support is fantastic. Scrolling through the OS feels great, especially in 120Hz. Not recommended for the battery life though. And the operating system performance is nice and stable, and hopefully it will only get better thanks to software updates. In terms of more intensive performance, This thing never skips a beat. As I briefly said in the screen section, watching videos on this thing is incredible thanks to the awesome display, and I'm thankful to say that in terms of providing the performance necessary to do this, the 6 Pro can definitely keep up. In terms of gaming, while I do certainly prefer more casual games, gaming on this device is certainly a possibility, and with that 120Hz refresh rate, you can, I don't know, play Counter-Strike on your phone. Could you imagine that? My favorite phone game is called Idle Coffee Corp, because it's fun and chill and about coffee, which I like. Overall performance on the 6 Pro is certainly good, and with 5 years of support as a minimum, the 6 Pro is certainly not going anywhere anytime soon. Quickly going back to hardware, we have the speakers. The Pixel 6 Pro does obviously feature built-in speakers with no 3.5mm jack, which is honestly to be expected at this point. The 6 Pro does feature a stereo speaker configuration, which is as always nice, and for some casual listening, whether that be audio to a video or just chucking on some music while you're cooking, the 6 Pro, as expected, does a pretty good job. Finally, we have the battery life, which has historically, especially in the last Pixel phone I tested, which was the 4a, has been very good. The Pixel 6 Pro features a battery size of 5,003 mAh, which I actually think is the biggest I've ever used, finally beating that Qbot phone I used back in like 2016. In terms of average day-to-day use, this thing can easily get a full day of usage, but on excessive days, you may actually need to plug this thing in. Remember that screen we talked about earlier and how big and high resolution it is? Well, despite the enormous battery, sometimes especially on media heavy days, that screen is going to drain your battery life. With fast charging, it is, as always, fast, but something my friend who uses adaptive charging noticed is that it can take a pretty long time to charge in this mode. I mean, it's a massive battery, adaptive charging isn't really the fastest, so yeah, be aware of that. It sounds obvious, but in real-world usage, some of these things can kind of creep up on you. Overall, though, my experience was pretty good. Through average day-to-day usage, this phone definitely got through, and yeah, certainly good enough for me. Okay, so to summarize, what do I think of this phone? Honestly, it's pretty awesome. While I'm not typically one for big phones, it allowed for this incredible screen that really is a standout point. The cameras take some amazing photos, and the battery life, as I said, is good enough for me, and the improved support cycle is very welcome. So this definitely feels like a flagship Android device. And if that sounds good to you, and you're willing to pay that Pro price tag, I definitely recommend considering it. Alright guys, so that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Let me know, by the way, what do you think of the 6 Pro? What do you like? What do you dislike? Are you planning on getting one? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading those. Once again, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. As for now though, as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, then smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.